The moment my son's attorney said my full name out loud in that courtroom, I watched the color drain from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He looked down at his papers, then back up at me, then down again. His hand was trembling. My son was sitting at the table across from me, smiling like he had already won. He didn't notice his own lawyer falling apart. That was the moment I knew it was over. Not for me. For them. But I should start at the beginning. I turned 63 last March. I spent the morning the same way I spend most mornings, coffee on the back porch, watching the oak tree I planted the year my son was born. It's enormous now, taller than the house. My late husband always said that tree would outlast all of us, and he was probably right. I was thinking about him that morning, the way I often do in the quiet hours, when my son called. He called every Sunday. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was the way he sounded. Too cheerful. The kind of cheerful that has an agenda behind it. "Mom," he said, "my wife and I were talking, and we think you should come stay with us for a while, just to get a change of scenery." I told him I was perfectly happy with my scenery. He laughed. Then he said something that made the hair on my arm stand up. He said, "We just worry about you being alone out there. You've been a little forgetful lately." I had not been forgetful. Not even slightly. I remembered every bill, every appointment, every password to every account I'd set up in the last decade. I held 3 advanced degrees and had spent 35 years doing work that required a level of precision and memory that most people never have to exercise in their entire lives. I did not forget things, but I didn't say any of that. I told him I appreciated the concern and that I'd think about the visit. Then I hung up, sat back down with my coffee, and started paying attention. That's something I learned a long time ago in my career. When something feels wrong, it usually is. Most people talk themselves out of that instinct. They call it paranoia. They call it overthinking. I spent decades being paid to follow that instinct all the way to the end, no matter how uncomfortable it made people around me. So I followed it. Over the next 3 weeks, I noticed the calls came more frequently. My son, then his wife, sometimes both of them together on speaker. Always the same soft, patient tone. Always the same gentle questions embedded in ordinary conversation. Had I gone to the grocery store? How did that go? Did I remember to take my blood pressure medication? Had I been sleeping okay? My daughter-in-law was particularly skilled at it. She had a voice like warm honey, smooth and sweet, and impossible to object to. She would call in the middle of the afternoon and ask me to tell her about a recipe I'd mentioned the week before, and then halfway through my explanation she would say, very gently, "Oh, Mom, I think last time you said you added the rosemary before the garlic. Do you remember saying that?" She'd say it so softly that I'd almost doubt myself. Almost. I'd said garlic before rosemary. I knew exactly what I'd said because I'd been making that dish for 40 years. But I began to understand what they were doing, and I said nothing. I let them believe it was working. One afternoon in April, I came home from my walk to find a car in my driveway that I didn't recognize. A woman was sitting on my front porch steps. She stood up when she saw me and introduced herself as a social worker from the county. She said my son had contacted the office with concerns about my ability to live independently. She had a clipboard and a form. She wanted to come in and do an assessment. I stood there for a moment on my own front walkway, looking at this woman who had been sent to my home without my knowledge or consent to evaluate whether I was capable of managing my own life. I let her in. I made her tea. I answered every question she asked clearly, precisely, with full detail. I recited my medications, my medical history, the names and contact information of my physicians, my financial institutions, the terms of my mortgage. I described my daily routine, my social activities, my exercise habits. When she asked me to recall 3 words she'd said at the beginning of the session, I repeated them back along with the exact sentence she'd used to introduce them. She left after an hour looking mildly embarrassed. My son called the next morning. He didn't mention the social worker. He asked how I was sleeping. That night, I went into my home office, the one my daughter-in-law had once gently suggested I turn into a guest room since, she said, I probably didn't need all those files anymore, and I opened my old notebook. Not a computer. A notebook. The habit of a lifetime. I wrote down everything. Dates, times, exact wording of conversations, every question that had been designed to sound like concern, every small suggestion that had been designed to plant a seed of doubt. I wrote down the social worker's name and the date of her visit. I wrote down the name of the county office she said she was from. Then I started making phone calls. Not to my son, to people I'd kept in contact with over the years, colleagues, former associates, people who still owed me a favor or two, not because of anything improper, but because in 35 years of work, you build relationships that don't just disappear when you retire. What I found over the next few weeks made my stomach turn. My daughter-in-law had applied, quietly and without my knowledge, to become my financial power of attorney. The paperwork listed 2 physician opinions about cognitive decline opinions I had never received, from appointments I had never attended, signed by a doctor whose name I didn't recognize. My son had co-signed the application. There was also a petition filed with the probate court, a guardianship petition. They were asking a judge to declare me legally incapacitated and transfer control of my finances and medical decisions to my son and his wife. The hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks from the date I found the paperwork. I sat with that information for a long time. I thought about calling my son and confronting him directly. I thought about how he might explain it. "Oh, Mom, we were scared. We just wanted to protect you. We didn't know how else to help." I thought about his wife's honey-soft voice and how she had stood in my kitchen admiring my countertops while she was simultaneously filing paperwork to take my home. I thought about my late husband, who had believed above all things that you don't show your hand until the moment it counts. So I did nothing. Or rather, I appeared to do nothing, which is an entirely different thing. I stopped correcting myself in phone calls. When my daughter-in-law nudged a memory, I let a small silence fall before answering, just long enough to seem uncertain. I asked my son to repeat himself once or twice, not because I hadn't heard him, but because it fit the picture they were painting. I mentioned, casually, that I'd had to write myself a note to remember to water my plants. I hadn't. My plans were fine, but they didn't know that. Meanwhile, I spent those 6 weeks preparing. I called my attorney, not the general practice attorney in town who handled my neighbor's real estate closings. My attorney, a woman I'd worked alongside for the better part of 2 decades, who now ran one of the most respected elder law practices in the state. She listened to everything I told her without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Dorothy, are they out of their minds?" I told her I didn't think it was a question of minds. I thought it was a question of money. My estate wasn't extravagant, but it was substantial. The house, which my husband and I had owned outright since the late 90s, had more than tripled in value. The retirement accounts, the investments we'd carefully managed for decades, a small piece of commercial property my husband had purchased on a hunch in 2003 that turned out to be a very good hunch. Altogether, the kind of number that makes people do things they never imagined they were capable of doing. My attorney filed an immediate response to the guardianship petition. She challenged the physician documentation which, upon formal review, unraveled spectacularly. The doctor whose signature appeared on both cognitive assessments had, in fact, never met me. His license number had been used without his knowledge. That detail became important later. I also quietly transferred certain assets into a trust structure my attorney had recommended, placing them beyond the reach of any guardianship order. Legal, clean, and sensible, the kind of thing any competent financial planner would suggest for someone my age, regardless of family drama. My son called 2 days before the hearing. His voice was different, tighter. I think his attorney had told him my lawyer had filed a response, and he was trying to figure out how serious I was. "Mom," he said, "we can still resolve this without going to court. My wife and I just want to make sure you're protected." I told him I looked forward to seeing him at the hearing. There was a long pause. "You're really going to show up?" he said. "Of course," I said. "It's about me, isn't it?" The probate courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling, fluorescent lighting, the particular institutional smell of a building where difficult things happen regularly and no one has time to care about ambiance. My son and his wife were already seated at the petitioner's table when I walked in. She was wearing a dark blazer and had her hair pulled back, very composed, very prepared. My son turned when he heard the door. When he saw me, he actually smiled. A wide, confident, close-your-eyes smile. He leaned over and said something to his wife, and she straightened her back slightly, like someone settling in to watch something they expected to enjoy. Their attorney, a man whose primary specialty appeared to be exactly this kind of proceeding, the legal machinery of taking things from people who were deemed too old or too soft to hold on to them, was arranging papers on the table. He was thorough, organized. He had clearly done this before. My attorney sat beside me. She had a single manila folder in front of her and a legal pad. She looked completely calm. The judge entered, and we rose. She was younger than me by perhaps 15 years. She had the particular bearing of someone who had spent long enough in courtrooms to stop being impressed by them, the quiet authority of a person who had heard most things there were to hear. She set her own papers on the bench, looked at the docket, and then looked up at the room. She looked at the petitioner's table. She looked at my attorney. And then she looked at me. I saw her expression change. It was subtle, the kind of shift that most people in the room wouldn't have caught. A slight widening of the eyes. A stillness. She looked down at the docket sheet in front of her, then back at me. She said my full name, not as a question, as someone confirming something they couldn't quite believe. I said, "Yes, Your Honor." "That's me." Their attorney stopped arranging his papers. He turned and looked at me properly for the first time since I'd walked in. His face went through several things at once: recognition, confusion, a recalculation that I could almost see happening in real time. My son was watching all of this. His smile had faded. He looked at his attorney. His attorney had set down his pen. The judge looked at my son's attorney. She asked him if he was aware of my professional background. He said he was not. She turned back to me, and I thought I saw, just briefly, something close to amusement in her expression before she composed herself. She said, "For the record, for those who may not be aware, the respondent spent 35 years as a federal prosecutor with the Department of Justice. She served as lead counsel in several landmark cases involving financial fraud, and she is the reason I went to law school. She had been in the audience for one of my cases when she was 22 years old. A law student who had gotten a seat in the gallery on a morning when I delivered a closing argument that took 2 hours and resulted in a conviction that the defense had spent $3 million trying to prevent. She had written me a letter afterward. I had written back. She had gone on to do extraordinary things. Life is long, if you're paying attention. The hearing proceeded. Their case was built on the 2 physician assessments, which my attorney systematically dismantled in about 20 minutes. The doctor's office had already provided an affidavit confirming that his signature had been used without his knowledge or authorization, which, as my attorney noted, was not simply a problem with the guardianship petition but potentially a criminal matter. The power of attorney documents had been drafted based on those assessments. Without them, the legal foundation for the entire petition was gone. Their attorney tried to redirect. He called my son to speak about specific incidents, moments when I had seemed confused, times I hadn't remembered conversations, an occasion when I had apparently left the house without my phone. I left my phone at home occasionally, by choice, because I am 63 years old and I enjoy a walk without a screen in my pocket, and that is not evidence of cognitive decline. My attorney asked my son, gently, whether he had ever personally observed me fail a cognitive assessment, whether any physician he had personally spoken to, as opposed to one he had located and paid, had expressed concern about my mental capacity, whether he had spoken to my actual doctors whose contact information was in his phone before filing the petition. The answers were no, no, and no. Then my attorney introduced the financial records. Over the previous 18 months, someone had been making small, irregular transfers from a joint account that my son and I had maintained since his father's illness, an account I had kept open for sentimental reasons and never fully closed. The transfers were modest individually. $60 here, $120 there, the kind of amounts that might go unnoticed by someone who wasn't watching. Added together, they came to just under $14,000. My son said he didn't know about those transfers. His wife's expression didn't change, not even slightly. That was when I knew for certain that it had been her, not him. My son had believed he was protecting me. His wife had been moving money and building a case simultaneously, and he had been, in the most painful sense, a tool. That understanding didn't make it hurt less. It made it hurt differently. The judge dismissed the guardianship petition in full. She referred the falsified physician documentation to the state attorney's office for review. She also referred the financial transfer records. As we were leaving the courtroom, she asked me to stay for a moment. She told me she was sorry for what I'd been put through. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She said she remembered that closing argument I had given, and that she had never forgotten the line I used near the end, that the most dangerous predators are the ones who make you feel safe right up until the moment they move. I hadn't planned that line. It had come to me in the middle of the argument, the way the best things sometimes do. I was glad it had meant something to someone. My son was waiting in the hallway outside. His wife was not with him. She had walked ahead or walked away, I wasn't sure which. He was standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, and when I came through the door, he looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was very small and had done something he couldn't explain and couldn't take back. He said, "Mom, I didn't know about the transfers." I told him I believed that. He said, "I really thought." He stopped. Started again. "She told me you'd been forgetting things. She showed me things. Texts where you seemed confused." I didn't. I told him I knew. He looked at the floor. He said, "I should have called you. I should have just called you and asked." Yes, he should have. And he hadn't. And we were both standing in a hallway outside a courtroom because of it, and there was no quick way through that. I had spent 35 years watching people reckon with the consequences of what they'd failed to do when it mattered, and I knew that reckoning took time. I told him we would talk. Not today, but soon, when we were both ready. He nodded. He looked very tired, and very young, and very much like his father. In the weeks that followed, the state attorney's office opened an investigation. The physician whose credentials had been fraudulently used cooperated fully, and the paper trail led clearly back to my daughter-in-law, who had researched the process extensively and made several decisions that had seemed calculated but turned out to be traceable. She had retained her own attorney. My son filed for divorce. I did not feel triumphant about that. I want to be clear about that. When you spend long enough pursuing justice professionally, you understand that outcomes are rarely clean. The right thing happening doesn't feel like winning. It feels like relief. And underneath the relief, there is almost always grief, because something had to break before it could be set right. I grieve the years my son spent believing a version of me, that his wife had constructed a version that was diminished and confused and in need of managing. I grieve that it took a courtroom to correct it. But I also know this: he calls me every Sunday, same as always, except now the calls are real. He asks how I'm doing and waits for the actual answer. He came and helped me repaint the back porch last month. We talked about his father while we worked, something we hadn't done together in longer than I want to admit. The oak tree was in full leaf. It looked, in the late afternoon light, almost impossible. 35 years in federal prosecution teaches you many things. It teaches you about patience and evidence and the difference between what people say and what the record shows. It teaches you that the truth, if you give it enough room, has a way of becoming unavoidable. But the thing it teaches you most persistently, the thing that comes back to me on the back porch in the mornings with my coffee, is that the people who underestimate you will always tell you they were doing it for your own good. I've yet to find one who was right.